Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in this great wide world. I'm doing a little bit of backpedaling here today. And what I'm talking about is um, it's just the reaction to why I had an issue on the ballot, um, sponsored or had the backing, or if you went by many of the Catholic churches, especially on the west side of Cincinnati, you saw a lot of vote no on issue one signs. And I'm sure this was also the case in many of the major cities across Ohio, but I'm offering some reflection on uh, what why the issue didn't pass, or well, it did pass, but I mean, why vote no did not work. And, and when I was reflecting about this today and yesterday, it is the dynamics, and I wrote a book on this. Don't buy your lottery ticket. And in the book itself that I talk about is the different generations, and part of the generations was the aftermath of COVID-19 and the fact that many of the reservations uh, as well, um, because I wrote a book on casino and the Native Americans. But in both cases, I wrote how many of the um, boomers and Gen X, especially early Gen X, buy a lot of the lottery tickets. And it's not necessarily a big issue with millennials and Gen Zs and the next generation after that, which I believe is Alpha. But the understanding here is that we're not necessarily talking about lottery tickets and casinos necessarily, but it's this mindset that existed um, about concerning personal rights or reproductive rights. And the issue is what went wrong with a lot of this was the fact that the Catholic Church backed this uh, vote no on issue one, and yet many of the millennials, the Gen Zs, really don't go to church. And they have a more emphasis on reproductive rights than necessarily, say, the boomers, what's left of the great generation, and the early Gen X people. So, what occurred here was a lot of the younger voters came out for yes rather than no. Now, does that mean the issue was worded wrong? No. Does that mean the issue is important? And it's not necessarily important in the right, it's the right, you know, uh, abortion issue, but it's the issue that becomes, and I'm a father of girls, and I can understand the rationale behind that because it's really about reproductive rights, and that they believe the courts nor the state of Ohio legislature have the right to dictate to them what they can do with their reproductive rights. And the rationale, and I've heard this from other women, especially Gen Zs and also millennials and late Gen X, is that their rationale behind it is very understandable. And the point here was I think the churches missed the boat on this, especially the Catholic churches, because I think they looked at it as abortion rights and not necessarily the right of the individual for reproductive rights. So the issue was somewhat lost in the later generations compared to the late generations, the boomers and the early Gen X, who tend to be the ones going to church and see the value in right to life. And a lot of these people go back to the 1973s with Roe versus Wade and saw the courts and the mixing of the courts on this. And then when you think about this, the reason the courts exist in the first place is that laws are there, excuse me, to help modernize things in life. So when we look at prohibition back in the 1920s, prohibition was illegal. In other words, you could not get alcohol, and and that was part of the temperance movement. And what this created was a lot of illegal operations and also increased the organized crime in the 1920s. So the issue became, let's legalize, especially under the FDR administration. Well, let's legalize alcohol and put a control on it. And when you think about this, and as a psychologist, I think about this. We're talking about reproductive rights of young women. I have to agree with what they're saying. Is this because we don't want back alley abortions? We don't want back alley decisions made about people's rights, and we've heard decisions about when somebody's got an abortion that they cannot get pregnant again because they botch up the abortion or whatever. And there's cases out on that. But when we think about this, and we think about the Second Amendment, we have to think that you know the Second Amendment was for the issue of you know people are created, although it was written by a very racist and very person that was white male dominated, but it was basically equal rights for all. So when we look at this, we have to say, yeah, equal rights for all. So, and you can't underestimate young generation because they're the ones that came out. And I really, there's always this with conspiracy theory concerning the 2020 election, that it was rigged or whatever. But the point out of that was you got a lot of people that were millennials, late Gen X, Gen Z people that came out and voted because they were concerned about their reproductive rights. And they had a cause to go out and vote. And not necessarily for baby boomers or, you know, early Gen X or what's left of the great generation. And when I think about this, and this is my second point about this, is laws change over time. I mean, case in point is when we look at the issue of slavery. Slavery was an abomination for the African American race, and it actually created a situation, especially in the South, where there was free labor, and they're not actually able to make a living because they were actually working agriculture. And if you look at some of the arguments back then, such as David Thoreau and Emerson, you find that the issue on capitalism was not necessarily a good viewpoint for the African Americans, because the fact of the matter, it was free labor, and the issue becomes their numbers are always construed on their production because the production was, especially in agriculture, was free labor. It was not, you're not giving. It's not like today where you have crop sharers, and then there again, that is going to be construed because they pay these people very low minimum wages, like it could be anywhere from $4 or $5. And a lot of times it's cash, so it's very hard to find that number. But back in the time of slavery, it was an issue because the fact that it was free labor, not necessarily something that where people can work themselves out of their situation. And that was the other issue, because the people couldn't work out of the situation. But the case in point, getting back to my argument about why the issue vote no did not pass, but because the yeses were more than the no's, because there again it was reproductive rights, and the issue was more on the Catholic Church, and many of the Catholic churches had it because there was a right to life and other issues concerning that, and then the legislation of the state as well as the House, and not necessarily looked for the issue to protect women's right to abortion, which, like I've said a few minutes ago, they are legally entitled to that by the Constitution of the United States. So to really cramp down on that is really not very constitutionally wise when you think about it. So it became more of a reaction or an emotional reaction to people, and not necessarily looking at the cause or the cusp of the issue, where it was women within the reproductive age that you were dictating to them their right to choose. And like I said, I'm not saying it was like slavery, but the analogy is that you were almost enslaving a group of women to say, well, you cannot have an abortion, though you're entitled to an abortion by the 14th Amendment number 2, but we can't do that. So the issue, when you really step back and look at it, is that people in their reproductive age have the right to choose, and as a society, and there's what I always call the police power, and the police power is the good and welfare of the whole community, and that changes. Like I said, I've talked before about slavery. The other issue becomes, we were once a society under Teddy Roosevelt where we had this mindset of not preservation but conservation. And when we looked at, we had Guilford Pinchot, James R. Garfield, who took national parks and forestry reserves, not necessary to preserve them, but to conserve them for future generations. So there was this dilemma that it was not preservation. And then as time went on, we went, which still is a big issue, and today there's this issue: what is conservation, what is preservation? So anyway, folks, the final point I want to make about that is the voting dynamics is also changing. We used to be, the state of Ohio used to be very conservative, and I'm beginning to think is in the next 20 years, the state will not necessarily be as conservative as or as what they said it's a red state. I think it's going to be a mixed state. Not blue is a Democratic state, or red is a Republican state. I think it's going to be a mixed state, especially in the urban settings. The rural settings will not change, and this is going to lead to some frustration. But there again, because we are a system of electoral college, it's the consequences that we pay as a society to be free, because the majority rules, and it's like I said, I've talked about this a couple minutes ago, and even in the early days of the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, the Federalists under Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton versus Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, Madison, where they believe more into state rights. But as time went on, we were formed under a federalist system, but excuse me. But when Jefferson won in 1800, we became more of a democratic, or we became more of a states' rights But that was due to the fact that the voting people, and that's the same thing that's going on right now. And though it is maybe not people feeling like they have, no voice, they do have a voice. It's just that then they may become a minority instead of a majority, which happens off and on throughout history. Anyway, these are some food for thoughts about issue one, and I think the legislature in Ohio needs to look at this, step back on this, and find out how they, especially the Republicans, because they have to figure out a way to entertain or get the votes of the younger generation, or they will lose more power and power as time goes. And within 20 years, their power within the state may be very diminished in many areas. Anyway, that's some food for thought. Thanks, folks. Have a great day. I'll try to post a video later this week, and hope to talk to you real soon. And have a great weekend. Bye.